The clock had just struck 2 a.m. and the hospital was in its eerie nighttime stillness. As an operating room nurse in a trauma center, the hum of the fluorescent lights above was louder tonight, almost as if they, too, were nervous. It had been a quiet shift, so far too quiet. As an operating room nurse, I was used to this eerie stillness, the strange quiet of a hospital in the dead of night. But tonight, something felt different. The air in the trauma center was thick with the kind of silence that made the smallest sound feel like a scream. The hospital's usual din footsteps, the occasional shout of urgency was absent. Instead, only the distant beeping of machines and the soft scrape of my own shoes on the polished floor filled the empty hallways. It was a silence that felt unnatural. I was used to these, the quiet, the waiting, the occasional adrenaline surge when an emergency case came through the doors. After prepping the rooms for the next day, my co-workers and I scattered to our usual hideouts, catching a moment's rest while staying close enough to hear any announcements. As always, the lull between emergencies became a breeding ground for idle chatter. It started innocently enough with complaints about how cold the trauma rooms always seemed to be and jokes about which surgeon had the worst handwriting. The conversation then drifted to other subjects, weekend plans, funny patient stories, and the occasional bit of drama we'd all witnessed during shifts. "Did you hear about Dr. Ramos in the cafeteria incident?" One of the techs chimed in, leaning casually against the desk. "Oh, don't tell me he's still fighting over that banana pudding," I said, rolling my eyes. "Not pudding this time," the tech replied with a smirk. Apparently, someone cut in line, and he went full courtroom drama on them. Pointed at the dessert and yelled, "I object." The OR suite was monitored by a network of cameras, with feeds displayed on screens at the front desk. That's where the charge nurse sat, keeping a watchful eye over the empty holes in rooms. It was routine, almost mundane, until it wasn't. "We've got a possible trauma incoming," the charge nurse announced over the intercom. Her voice crackled through the speakers, sharp and clear, pulling us from our corners. Groggy but alert, I made my way to the desk, joining the rest of the team. All of us except for one. My partner, Emily, was missing. "Where's Emily?" the charge nurse asked, her tone edged with annoyance. We shrugged, assuming she'd fallen asleep in one of the rooms. The charge nurse turned to the monitors, scanning each camera feed for signs of her. That's when we saw it. Room 9. The lights were off, but the dim glow from the hallway illuminated the room enough to see someone sitting in the chair at the nurse's desk, legs crossed, one foot bobbing up and down. The figure faced away from the camera. The movement was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. "There she is," the charge nurse muttered, picking up the phone. She dialed the extension for room 9. On the monitor, we watched as the figure moved slightly, leaning toward the phone, but it didn't pick up. The leg kept bouncing. "Seriously," the charge nurse huffed. "I'll get her myself." "No, I'll go," I offered, already heading down the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. As I made my way to room 9, the door was closed. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open and flicking on the lights. The room was empty. The chair was there, neatly tucked under the desk. No one was sitting in it. The air felt colder than the rest of the OR suite, a biting chill that raised goosebumps on my arms. I checked behind the equipment, inside the supply cabinet. Nothing. "Emily," I called out, my voice breaking the silence. No answer. I returned to the front desk, expecting to see her there, laughing off her little prank, but she wasn't. Instead, she came strolling toward us from the opposite end of the suite, a bundle of supplies in her arms. "What's going on?" she asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. The charge nurse and I exchanged a look. "Where were you?" "In the supply closet," she replied, stocking sutures. "Why?" We turned back to the monitors. The camera feed for room 9 was still live. The figure was still there, sitting bobbing its leg. A chill ran through me, cold and sharp, settling deep in my chest. "That can't be right," I whispered. None of us wanted to check room 9 again. The charge nurse, pale and visibly shaken, decided we'd handle the trauma case on the opposite end of the OR suite. We worked in uneasy silence, avoiding each other's eyes and the cameras. As the hours crept on, the unease lingered. Every creak of the floor, every hum of machinery seemed amplified, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I caught myself glancing at the monitors repeatedly, half hoping and half dreading to see that chair again. I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being watched. At one point, during a lull in the trauma case, I found myself staring at the locker room door. I remembered the photo the day staff had mentioned. Curiosity and dread battled within me, but curiosity won. I made my way to the locker room, each step echoing in the empty corridor. The fluorescent light flickered faintly overhead as I entered. Pinned to the bulletin board was a faded photograph of a smiling woman in scrubs, her hair neatly pulled back. "Mary," the caption read in scrawled handwriting. The edges of the photo were yellowed with age, but her eyes seemed to gleam with a peculiar intensity, as though she could see right through me. I felt a shiver run down my spine and quickly left the room. When I returned to the trauma bay, the charge nurse's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the monitors. "She's gone," she said softly. I followed her gaze to the feed for room 9. The chair was empty now. The rhythmic bobbing was no more. A part of me felt relief, But another part, the part that couldn't forget that photograph, felt an unsettling emotion. Where had she gone? The veterans had been speaking in hushed tones as the hours passed, their conversations low and wary. At first I thought nothing of it until the conversation shifted to room 9. The next morning, as the day staff filtered in, we recounted the night's events. Expecting skepticism, we were surprised by their reactions. The veterans exchanged wary glances. One of them finally spoke up, her voice low and deliberate. "Room 9 has a reputation," she said, choosing her words carefully. "There have been incidents, things seen. Things we don't talk about often." "Like what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Another nurse leaned in, her expression grave. "Years ago, a nurse had surgery here. She didn't make it off the table. Since then, strange things happen in that room. People have seen shadows, heard voices. But whatever it is, it doesn't like being disturbed. Doesn't like being disturbed." I echoed, the words twisting like ice in my chest. "Just stay out of room 9 if you can help it," the first nurse said, her voice firm. "And if you're ever in there alone and something feels off, leave. Don't question it. Don't linger. Just leave." The conversation had taken a darker turn, but there was something even more disturbing in the whispers of the veterans and doctors who spoke of the ghost, a quiet rumor that had lingered among them, one that hadn't yet reached the ears of most of the newer staff. "You don't know the full story," a veteran doctor added, his voice low. He had a far-off look in his eyes, as if remembering something that still haunted him. "Mary, she was kind, bright, she had a passion for her work. It was all she wanted. To keep helping, to keep working in that org." I leaned in, sensing that there was more. "She was in surgery one night, a routine procedure, but the doctor made a mistake. It wasn't something anyone could have foreseen, a small error. Something that most surgeons wouldn't even think about. It caused the surgery to fail. She didn't survive. But that wasn't the worst part." He paused, collecting his thoughts, and the room fell silent. The doctor, Dr. Harrisy, was the one who operated on her. He swore he'd done everything right, but there was a mistake. That error led to her death, and after that, she never left. The rumor goes that Mary, she didn't want to believe she was gone. She still believed she could work, still thought she'd be needed again, and somehow she haunts him, or rather lures him to room 9. I felt a chill as I processed his words. "Lures him?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Yes," he replied. "It's said that whenever Dr. Harris comes close to room 9, he feels her presence. Sometimes, the door will be ajar when he passes by. He can hear the soft creak of her chair, the rhythmic bobbing of her foot. It pulls him back to that room again and again, like an irresistible compulsion. And every time he walks in, it's just wrong. The air goes cold, everything feels off. Yet, he keeps going. Until one night, he went in and never came out." The doctor's gaze turned darker, haunted. "The cameras caught him that night, alone in room 9. The next morning, no one could find him. All that was left was a mess: his surgical gloves, his stethoscope, and a clipboard on the floor, and the chair. The one Mary always sat in. Empty, like it had never been touched." I stood still, unable to speak. A shiver ran down my spine. "We found his body in the supply closet later that day," the veteran doctor added, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it wasn't the same. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, and his hands were shaking uncontrollably, like he'd been touched by something that left him broken." He paused, looking at me with a solemn expression. "You're not the only one who's felt it. Believe me, but you should know room 9, it doesn't let go, so be careful, okay?" I swallowed hard, a part of me wishing I hadn't asked. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The weight of their warnings settled over me like a shroud. They didn't dismiss what we'd seen, they didn't joke or explain it away. They knew. I've worked many nights since then, but I avoid room 9 whenever I can. Even in the brightness of the day shift, the thought of that empty chair sends shivers down my spine. And sometimes, late at night, when the suite is quiet and the cameras are rolling, I'll glance at the monitors and half expect to see her there. It had been 2 weeks since the night I first noticed the strange events surrounding room 9. The haunting feeling had begun to settle into my bones, an underlying sense of dread I couldn't shake. During the days I went about my work, but as soon as the lights dimmed and the last of the day staff trickled out, the dread crept back. That night, it was quieter than usual. The air felt thick, the hum of the machines filling the silence like a warning. I found myself walking down the hallway at 3 a.m., far later than I should have been for a quick break, but something tugged at me, a curiosity I couldn't fight. As I approached the hallway that led to room 9, I noticed the lights flickering in the distance. The faint glow barely reached the hallway before me, casting strange shadows across the floor. My heart began to race, and I knew what I had to do, what I should have done 2 weeks ago. Leave, but my legs moved on their own, the compulsion to understand what was going on overwhelming me. I rounded the corner and stopped dead in my tracks. The door to room 9 was ajar. The air, already cold, now felt like it was biting into my skin. I could feel the presence in the room, pressing against the very air around me. The lights flickered again, and then, in the faint glow of the hallway, I saw her, the woman from the photograph. Her figure was blurred as though she were part of the shadows themselves. but her eyes, they were the same as the ones in the photo. She turned toward me, slowly, and I froze. She wasn't smiling. The figure stepped forward, and in that instant I understood what the veterans had meant. She didn't want to be disturbed. I bolted down the hallway, not daring to look back, not even when I heard her footsteps echoing behind me, soft but growing louder with every step. I made it back to the front desk, breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I knew it won't solve anything anyway, but from that night on, every time I passed the door to room 9, I would glance at the monitors, half expecting to see her again. And every time, the fear returned. The chair would always be empty, but I knew better now. She was still there.